Why am I me? Not somebody else. Where was I before I was born? What happens after I die? In some way or another, we all have these questions about the nature of self and the basis of consciousness. Why do we experience things?
Do you find any answers?
Our experiences of the world and of the self are kinds of controlled hallucination. So it may be that the world itself is a kind of computer simulation.
So everything that we see is wrong, is not the real truth.
But opinions have changed dramatically over the last centuries about what's conscious and what isn't. I don't think consciousness is specifically human. Non-human animals, many of them, maybe most of them, maybe all of them, are conscious to some extent. We'd all agree AI will reach the point quite soon where it will seem conscious. We're going headlong into territory where we don't know what the consequences are going to be.
So you are scared when you see all these?
A little bit, yes. It's a goal to build a conscious machine. We collectively need to pay attention to that possibility and actually minimize the chances of it happening.
Why to stop this from happening?
This would be ethically catastrophic.
Who are you?
I'm Anil Seth. I'm a professor of neuroscience at the University of Sussex. At least that's what it says on my job description. But who am I really is a very different question.
Who are you really?
Well, this is what I've been trying to understand through the lens of neuroscience and philosophy for many, many years, for decades, in fact. This question of what it means to be, not just me, Anil Seth, but what it means to be any person or indeed anything. There's one of these fundamental mysteries that I think we all think about at some point in our lives, perhaps when we're very young. I think everyone when they're young asks the question, why am I me? Not somebody else. And where was I before I was born? What happens after I die? In some way or another, we all have these questions about the nature of self and the basis of consciousness. Why do we experience things? These are common questions that we ask ourselves, but then most of the time we stop asking them and we go on and do other useful things. But I've been just unable to let go of these questions and have tried to pursue them throughout my career in research.
Did you find any answers?
Yeah, lots of answers, but not any final conclusion to the mystery. This is it's a beautiful thing about science in general, right? I think what can happen is that the questions that you ask change along the journey, and the answers that you get are productive both in when they provide new understanding, but also when they open even more questions. So the journey just keeps on going. But I've been very lucky. In the last 30 years, the scientific approach to understanding consciousness and self has really undergone a renaissance. And when I started in the early 1990s as an undergraduate, the subject of consciousness, how and why a thing, anything, whether it's a brain or a person or an animal or even a computer or whatever it might be, how consciousness happens, how it fits into our picture of the universe was not really considered a legitimate part of neuroscience or psychology or science in general. It was considered the realm of philosophy, perhaps even theology. And that has changed. It's changed pretty dramatically over the last 30 years. And now, as I think it should be, questions about consciousness are once again front and center of investigations into the mind, into the brain, and they bring together lots of different disciplines. We work with physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists and philosophers, social scientists, because a question like consciousness isn't confined neatly to any single discipline or any single way of thinking. It's broad, it straddles multiple perspectives and requires the creativity that you get when you mix different disciplines together.
So the question that you are trying to answer is, what is it, or where it's coming from? What exactly question are you trying to answer about consciousness?
There's a number of related questions. the most fundamental question is, as you said, what is it? What kind of thing is consciousness? And here, opinions really differ. There are some philosophical perspectives that say, well, it doesn't really exist at all. At least it's not in the way we think of it. We're just kind of confused that there is something to explain when we think we need to explain consciousness. Other perspectives see consciousness as fundamental, part of the fabric of the universe. This is a view called panpsychism, where consciousness is a bit like mass, energy, or electric charge. It's really ubiquitous and basic. And then there's all sorts of positions in the middle. And in my work, it's really exploring how far we can understand consciousness by thinking of it as a property of things brains and bodies do, as a biological property. This is a pretty standard view. But it's worth stepping back a second and just defining consciousness. It's always very hard to define it precisely, but a good working definition, a good starting point, is the definition from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And he said, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. So it feels like something to be me, to be you, to be a bat, to be a kangaroo, but it doesn't feel like anything to be a table or a chair or a laptop computer. Some might disagree with that. I think it's true that these are just objects. The computer's a complicated object, but it's still an object. Consciousness, in one sense, is what makes us more than just objects. Now, when I open my eyes, it's not just that my brain responds to things out there in the world and then I act. No, there's a whole other dimension. My mind is filled with light and shade and color and shape. I have a visual experience, and that's what we're trying to explain when we're trying to explain consciousness.
Okay, so it's something that it feels like to be the redness of red, or it feels like, for my experience, to have. But the interesting point about you is that you actually are a neuroscientist, and you are just trying to understand where exactly is coming from the brain. So, did you find anything that is interesting? Did you find specific?
I think that's an example of a question that's only going to get you so far. I don't think there's one place in the brain where consciousness hides, and we just have to uncover it. This idea of there being a single seat of consciousness goes back to René Descartes in hundreds of years ago, when he suggested the pineal gland, this part of the brain in the middle, that would be where the realm of the mental interfaces or interacts with the realm of the physical. And he was wrong about that. I think he's wrong in many ways, but the pineal gland is not where consciousness lives. There's this very active debate in the field in general, trying to look for what's been called the neural correlates of consciousness. And the idea here is, instead of asking the hard problem, or addressing the hard problem, which is the sort of terminology that the philosopher David Chalmers uses, the hard problem of how consciousness happens and why it's there at all, we should start with the more empirically tractable problem of which parts of the brain are associated with consciousness. Where are its footprints in our neural circuitry? And we can do this by comparing, like, what happens in the brain when people fall asleep and lose consciousness or have general anesthesia, or when people are conscious. We can have situations where we can control what they are conscious of. So sometimes they're conscious of something, sometimes not, and we can compare.
Can I ask, so when we sleep, we lose consciousness completely?
Not always, no. And in fact, sleep is really complicated itself. Now, certainly when we're dreaming, we're conscious. And I think that's true by definition. I mean, dreams are defined as streams of conscious experience that happen during sleep. But there are also stages of sleep when we're not dreaming, where we're still conscious. And we know this by experiments that wake people up in the middle of the night, in different stages of sleep, and ask them whether there was anything going on. Can they remember anything happening in their mind? And most of the time, people will say something was happening. It might be something really simple, but something was usually happening. There are some periods of sleep which might be completely without consciousness. They're very deep sleep, which can actually happen more early on. When you initially go to sleep, you tend to go into the deeper stages of sleep first. And those states are more likely where consciousness is completely absent. But if we're looking at a really reliable contrast between consciousness and its absence, I prefer to think about general anesthesia, which is not a state we encounter very often, though I've had general anesthetic a few times, and I don't know if you have. Have you had general anesthesia?
No,
Well,
but I bet people that are listening had.
That's right. And so for anyone listening, have a think about what that felt like compared to going to sleep. And one thing that always struck me about that was that when I fall asleep and wake up, even if I'm jet lagged, just arrived in a new city or something, I might be confused about the time, but I'm always aware roughly how much time has passed. It's going to be a few hours, or maybe I didn't sleep hardly at all and it's a couple of hours or less. But under anesthesia, it's different. You're gone and then you're back. And no time seems to pass. The gap just seals up. In that time, you are not there. Consciousness is gone. You are turned into an object and then back again into a person. And that is completely different. Under anesthesia, I could have been gone for 5 minutes or 5 years. It would have been the same because the ends just join up seamlessly. So that for me indicates that deep general anesthesia is a much more profound manipulation of consciousness than we ever get in sleep.
It's crazy what you're saying. You're saying that when we are under anesthesia, we're turning into objects, no different than a table, in a way.
Well, living objects. I mean, we're still
living
much more complicated than tables.
But it's crazy to think about that we become that everything that we are is consciousness. And then when you take the consciousness away, and then there is a gap. And what is that gap? What is that object? It's interesting.
Yeah, and from the first person perspective, there is no gap. You count down from 10, you're gone, and then literally the next thing you know, I mean, this is how it's often described, but it's not an approximation. I mean, that is how things happen. The very next thing you know, the next moment, the next subjective moment is in the recovery room, assuming everything's gone well and you don't wake up in the middle of the operation. And so, there is no gap from the first person perspective, but from the third person perspective, and I've been in the operating theatre when I've seen people go under general anesthesia as well. And that's fascinating because you get the sense of this person losing some essence. I think that's overdoing it. I mean, we always have this tendency to project essence into something. And I don't think consciousness is an essence, but it's certainly very evocative that they've just become a living object now, which of course is why anesthesia works, because if somebody is a living object, well, then you can go ahead and cut into them and fix things and mess around. And it's good that there's no first person perspective. There's nothing at all going on for that person.
So a distinction between flower is better than the table. So we become a flower.
Well, yeah, that's not a bad. That's a much nicer way to put it. But it does mean that and maybe I hope this doesn't come across as disconcerting, because anesthesia is very, very reliable. It's perhaps one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century, certainly. But when people go for surgery, and if the anesthesiologist says something like, well, you'll go to sleep for a while and then you'll wake up and we'll be done, they are not telling you the truth. You are not just asleep. If you were asleep, you'd wake up as soon as a knife cut through your skin. Now you're going into a state much more profound. It has much more in common with things actually called the vegetative state, which is a condition that people can have after brain damage, where consciousness is gone too. But general anesthesia is obviously reversible. I mean, that's why it works. It's temporary and it's reversible, but it's substantially more than sleep, especially in its. You can give people mild anesthesia where they might not lose consciousness completely, and it might look more like sleep or drowsiness. But if you give people a sufficient dose of general anesthetic, yeah, they're gone.
And I'm sure this is not a revolutionary idea or something. I'm sure you already probably researched it a lot. So you research what happens where exactly in the brain it shuts off when we have anesthesia.
So there is research in my own lab. We've looked at other people's data on this, but there's a lot of research on this. In fact, it's been one of again, 30 years ago when this research was getting going, there was surprisingly little interaction between people working in anesthesiology and people working in the neuroscience of consciousness. Now there's a lot more. There's a lot of studies where we trace very carefully what happens. And one lesson that's coming out of it is that it's not one specific region of the brain that goes quiet or turns off. What seems to happen is that the many brain regions become more isolated from each other. So in normal waking consciousness, our brains are full of busy communication. Different brain regions are always communicating, interacting with each other. And it's in these interactions that it seems that our minds and our conscious experiences arise. And under anesthesia, the brain is in a state where its different parts become isolated from each other. And we know this. There's a beautiful experiment by my colleague and friend Marcello Massimini in Italy, where he used a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now, this is a technique where you basically take a magnet and you put it near the brain, you turn it on very briefly, and you send a pulse of energy into the brain. You don't feel this, but you can measure the response. You can, using EEG, electroencephalography, which is just sort of electrodes on the surface of the head. You can measure the response to this pulse. It's a bit like throwing a stone into a pond of water and seeing where the ripples go. And in a conscious brain, the ripples are very complicated. So you have a pulse of energy that goes into the brain, and it basically bounces around all over the place for quite a long time, coming and going in complicated patterns. And you can quantify, you can put a number to how complex these patterns are. Under general anesthesia, it's a bit like throwing a stone into a still pond. So you see a big ripple, there's a big ripple, but it dies away and then it's gone. And it doesn't really reappear anywhere else or do anything complicated. A single big response and then nothing. And what that indicates is that really the different parts of the brain are not communicating with each other in the same rich way they are during consciousness. So these are the experiments that I think are really at the moment at the cutting edge of all this stuff. We can see it's not in the single area, it's in how different brain regions interact with each other. And the really exciting thing here is we can put a number to this, and we can begin to measure how conscious somebody is without having to ask them, and just based on how their brain responds to this pulse of energy. And having a meter for consciousness is both scientifically really transformational, but also in the clinic, in hospitals, it's incredibly important too. We want to know whether people are conscious after brain damage and so on.
What does that mean in real life? Like, you have me, I taste this and it tastes 10 times better than if another person tastes this. to my taste? Like, how does that work? Like, other person having more consciousness than other person?
Well, I don't think it's a question here of one person being more conscious than another. It's also, although we can put a number to these things now, I think that's very much a simplification. Like consciousness, I don't think lies on a single scale. As some things in science do, temperature lies on a single scale. And one number is enough to fully characterize the temperature of a system, right? It's just that's the way temperature works. But consciousness isn't like that, I don't think. Yeah, you've got these big differences between being unconscious in coma and so on, and being conscious, and then you've got drowsiness and things in the middle. But really being conscious is something that is very much richer than a single dimension. Like I might be more vividly aware of the taste, of the tea that I'm drinking, or I don't know what you're drinking, coffee, hopefully.
Tea.
Okay, even better. Might be the taste of the tea. That might be really vivid for you, but the sound of whatever around you might be less vivid, or you might be really ruminating, thinking about worrying about something you've got to do later today, or that might be very much in the background of your mind, and you're not really experiencing it very strongly. We might live in the present more than we live in the future, and that might vary from person to person. So there's lots of ways in which consciousness might vary between individuals, and even within individuals. You can experience things differently from one moment to the next, and certainly one day or 1 year to the next. And how you taste the tea, not the coffee, how you taste the tea. I mean, I think that's one of these questions that we're beginning to get an empirical grip on as well. Like, how do we experience the same world differently? We can inhabit the exact same shared objective reality, yet have different experiences of that. And that's one of these areas of research. That's something that in my lab, we're really looking into quite a lot. How does that happen? How different are our inner worlds?
Okay, just to summarize what you said before. So as far as you understand, is not somewhere in the brain, is just the brain interacting with all the parts of the brain. Some is the interaction of all this stuff. That's where probably consciousness coming from. But you mentioned now every person has different conscious experience. So maybe something happens to me and something happens to a different person, but we share all as the same reality. And and you said you have a lot of research about that. Can you speak about the topic a bit? Because you mentioned it in your TED talk and it was so brilliant. You gave the example of the dress, that it was different color and other people saw it in different colors. So
yeah, I was going to mention that again. I mean, you obviously remember it, and I'm imagining a lot of your listeners will also remember this photograph of a dress that half the world would swear it was a photo of a blue and black dress, and the other half of humanity would sell their grandmother or stake their grandmother's life on the dress being white and gold. Two very different interpretations of the same photo. And what was interesting to me was not so much that people saw different things, but the conviction they had that their way of seeing was the right way, and that the inability, the difficulty of taking on board that somebody else could see something differently. I think this is fascinating. I mean, this is a little bit of a diversion, but I think this is hugely relevant to the world we live in today, with all its social media echo chambers. People who hold strong beliefs about politics or religion or whatever it might be. We get
so
into the terrain
beautiful.
where, like, it seems when people are strongly believing one thing, the conceivability of an alternative belief is very, very hard to take on board. And I think the example of the dress is really useful here, because it just shows that it doesn't even have to be something as high level, as abstract as a belief. Like, this can happen just for the simple color of a photo of a dress. And if we understand that other ways of seeing are possible, and that the way things seem to us might not be the only way, that opens, I think that gives us a chance to cultivate a little bit of necessary humility about what we believe also.
Oh my God, that this is kind of a huge breakthrough for me. Now I'm like, Hamas and Israel and Palestine, probably a similar thing now. They just see a different part of the dress. And they're so both convicted by their own truth. And every problem in the world, not every problem, most of the problems that we fight, there is, both of us can be right in a way, because both of us saw the right color in a way.
Well, I think that those examples also show some of the limitations of this metaphor as well, right? I think firstly because, let's be honest, like a photo, showing people a photo of a dress and having them realize that they can see it differently is not going to solve the world's problems. It's not going to transform these situations. And also, there is a ground truth. It's not that everything is relative to. So even with the dress, if you actually saw the real dress and not just a photo of the dress, there's no ambiguity. That dress is blue and black.
Interesting.
It's the particular ambiguities of the photo. Briefly, it's the fact that the surrounding light conditions in the photo are ambiguous in exactly the right way that it hits this spot of instability in how our brain works, so that we tend to see it one way or another. And so this is why I worry a little bit about projecting too much relativism here. Another example that comes to my mind, because it's closer to home, is what happened in the UK in 2016 with the Brexit referendum, right? And this divided society. I was very strongly on one side. I wanted to stay in the European Union. Other people, clearly, basically almost exactly the same number, maybe slightly more, obviously, because that's the way it went, thought the opposite. And it's very hard to understand the perspective from the other side. And here, again, is there a ground truth? Well, maybe there is actually. Maybe there's some way in which objectively it would have been better to stay in. We don't know for sure now, but you can definitely make that case. And in the same way, in any political or military conflicts, it's less about deciding what the real situation is, and more about trying to understand how people can remain unable to appreciate the perspectives of others, even if those perspectives don't track reality. That's the value of it.
That's very interesting. So you basically, just rephrasing what you said, it's not about what's the truth. It's about being more empathetic about other people's opinion, that these are what they believe that's real, like the dress. So, and being empathetic to the other opinion as well, that is not, they're not lying. That's what they saw. So,
right.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a whole different question about what is the relationship between what somebody perceives or believes and what objectively is the case. And that's a different question. And that's also not a simple question, because I said a moment ago that if I showed you the real dress, there would be no ambiguity that it is in fact blue and black. But even that is not really true, because colors don't really exist independent of a mind anyway. So what's actually out there in the world is this stuff, and it's a dress is made of a particular stuff that reflects light in a particular way, and our brains are sensitive to 3 wavelengths of this light, and these wavelengths, we call them red, green, and blue, but they're not colored. They're just different wavelengths of light, and our brain creates color out of ratios among these different wavelengths of light. So to say it's objectively true that the dress is blue and black is also wrong. There's a lot of interesting questions there about how our perception relates to reality. So if we all agreed on what color something is, we might take the people who disagreed about the dress and then they look at a car, or they look at the real dress and they all agree, like the real dress, yeah, it's blue and black, or that car is a red car. Well, there's still an interesting question about what is the real situation. We only ever perceive things indirectly. We never experience the world as it really is. At least that's my take on things.
So everything that we see is wrong, is not the real truth.
I'd be very careful to say the latter. So it's I think we have to be careful when we say like right or wrong or accurate or inaccurate, because we tend to saying that our perceptual experience is right or wrong or accurate or inaccurate tends to assume that it could be entirely correct or entirely accurate. There could be a way of experiencing the world that, we'd take all of our filters and biases away and we'd experience things as they really are. I just don't think that even makes sense. Like, back to color, how do we experience how things really are? Color can never be accurate or right in one sense, because it's both less than what's really there. We only sample 3 wavelengths of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and it's also more than what's there because we experience millions of colors, not just 3. So it's neither right nor accurate, but it is extremely useful. And in normal vision for human beings, the color experiences that we have track a very useful physical property of the world, which is how surfaces reflect light and how they do it in a way that's invariant to the ambient lighting condition. This is really helpful. So in our experience, it helps us keep track of objects as things change. Extremely useful thing to do that is geared to reality. It's tied to reality in a way that evolution has made very sure is useful for us. So in a sense, if our perceptual experience is doing that, we can call it accurate, we can call it right, but it's not accurate or right in the sense of matching exactly how reality is. It's accurate or right in revealing features of the objective reality in ways that are useful for us. And so, not everything is like color. If I'm trying to cross a road and I see a lorry coming fast towards me. Now, there really is, if my perception is working fine, then there really is a large physical object moving towards me. I need to get out of the way, otherwise I will be killed. So a perceptual experience that shows me a lorry coming towards me is both accurate and right by that criterion. But when I see the lorry and hear it, that's still a construction. That is not the thing itself. That's my brain making a prediction about what's happening out there in the world. And that's what I'm experiencing, the brain's prediction about what's happening in the world.
But me and you and all the 8 billion people that we probably experiencing the same way reality, but let's say a dog might be experiencing different way reality. So is it the machine that determines, that you have the brain that you have that determines, and how different? Because I came up with one example. If I grew up in a country that we call apples oranges, and we call it orange, I will never know if I talk with you that the orange is not the same experience, or a mandarin or an orange is a different experience. So how do we have the same that was a bad example. People will make fun of me, but it's okay. but yeah, why do you said that we have different experiences, and from every person it differs, the reality that we have. Can you explain a bit more why and how this is happening?
Yeah, sure. And I think where we'll get to is this question of, like, if people differ from one another, then what can we say about other animals as well? If you and I differ in how we experience the world, then what can we really say about how a dog or a dolphin experiences things? But yeah, it's good to step back and ask, why is this happening? What's going on? So this is really the question of, in the study of consciousness, what I like to call conscious content. This is no longer like the difference between anesthesia and being awake. Now we're asking the question that when you are conscious, what are you conscious of? How do we explain what you're conscious of, whether it's a blue and black dress or an apple or an orange or whatever it might be? This is the question of perception. How does the brain make sense of all the signals that continually bombard the eyes and the ears and all the senses? And as a result of that, the brain somehow conjures into existence this experience of a world out there and of a self within it. So imagine for a second that you are your own brain. And this is a useful exercise. So hopefully, like all the listeners as well, if you try and imagine being your own brain, trying to make sense of what's out there in the world, and all you have to go on as a brain are these electrical signals, which they're only indirectly related to what's out there. And as we said with color, the signals, they don't come with labels on, right? They're just electrical impulses that come into this electrified pate inside our skulls that we call our brains. And so to make sense of these, the idea is the brain has to combine its prior knowledge, some internal expectation about the way the world is, the way the body is, to make sense of these sensory signals. And the way, at least that I think, and it's not only me, I mean, there's a long tradition in thinking this way. The way brains do this, human brains certainly, is that the brain is constantly making predictions about what's out there in the world based on the knowledge that it has accumulated over evolution during development from your childhood onwards and your recent memories. It's making predictions and it's using the sensory data to update these predictions. And by always trying to update predictions to predict what's going to happen, to minimize the error between what the brain predicts and what it gets, the brain is able to make a best guess of what's actually out there. It's a way for the brain to infer the most likely causes of the sensory information that it gets. And the idea is that is what we perceive. It doesn't, our perceptual experience in this view, it's not a readout of the sensory information. Rather, the brain is always actively creating our experience of the world in an inside-out direction. It sort of flips it. It feels like we just read the world out. The world is out there and it just pours itself into our minds through our eyes and our ears. But no, I think exactly the opposite is going on. The brain is continually creating a world. We experience it as the real world that's independent of our minds, but it isn't. What we experience is the brain's best guess of the causes of the sensory signals that it gets. And it uses the sensory signals to keep the brain's best guess geared to the world in useful ways.
Are you saying that consciousness is a prediction machine?
Kind of. I quite like the term. So I think the brain is a prediction machine, at least to a first approximation. I think understanding the core business of the brain as predicting the causes of its sensory inputs, that's a really, really helpful way to understand what brains do and why they do it. And then I think we can understand our conscious experiences through that lens as the content of the brain's predictions. That is what we experience, not a readout of the sensory signals. What we experience comes from the inside out. just as much, if not more than, from the outside in. Now, this isn't something that has been rigorously demonstrated by loads and loads of experiments. It's still very much up for grabs. It's one theory about consciousness among several. But for me, it's the one that makes the most sense, has quite a lot of support in experiments, and it's really interesting. It really challenges how we intuitively think about our relationship to the world and what the self is. Because the self in this view is also a kind of perceptual prediction. The self isn't the thing that does the perceiving. In this view, the self is another kind of brain-based best guess, but in this case about the body mainly, rather than about the world.
It's actually a very revolutionized idea that we are creating, the reality is not here, but we are creating the reality in our brains.
Well, again, I keep sort of hesitating and saying it's not quite like that, but I think it's important because it's not that we create reality. Reality is there, but the way we experience that reality, that's always a construction. So the metaphor, the phrase I like to use, I've used it a lot, and it's not perfect, but it's not bad, is that our experiences of the world and of the self are kinds of controlled hallucination. And both parts of this are important. So our experiences are like hallucinations in the sense they come from within. Now, when we think about hallucinations, typically we think about, people experiencing things that are not there, voices in the head, then when nobody is speaking, or visions of somebody who isn't really there. And normally we think of hallucinations as completely different from normal perception, which we take as, that's seeing the world as it is. But I think there's a lot more continuity between hallucination and perception than often thought. All of our perceptions come from within. They're all kinds of hallucination in this sense. But normal perception is a controlled hallucination where the brain's constructions are very, very closely tied to or controlled by objective reality, reality as it exists independently of our minds and our brains. So this is not, again, it's not some collapse into relativism where anything goes. No. There are criteria by which perception can be better or worse. It can tie more closely to objective reality or not. And in general, not always, but in general, when perceptual experience is closely geared to reality, that's probably better in most cases. And this gives us a way to think about hallucination, because when people are actually hallucinating, whether it's in psychosis or whether it's in psychedelics or some other condition, you can equally understand that as, okay, this is still like the normal mechanisms of perception, but now the control aspect has gone a bit wrong. So the brain's predictions are not being reined in by the real world in the way that they normally are. I think that's really helpful because it means that we don't treat it as a completely different thing. And we treat it as just the same mechanism, but it's gone into a different state. And I think understanding that really helpful because we can make sense of these hallucinations more easily, their meaning and why they're happening. And also it can help understand what's actually happening in the brain and lead to treatments and diagnosis and other good medical things.
Do you think we evolved all to, and somewhere along the way we got consciousness? Can we recall that 100 years ago this is what where we, or it was like exactly the levels that you said? We had like 1% consciousness, then 10% consciousness, then 90% consciousness. How does that work?
Very hard to say. I mean, I think way more than 100 years. Like, I don't think consciousness is specifically human. You mentioned dogs earlier. So I think non-human animals, many of them, maybe most of them, maybe all of them are conscious to some extent. And I do think that consciousness evolved. Like everything in biology, pretty much everything, it evolved. And consciousness is is very useful. I mean, the way we experience the world is very useful in helping us survive. We experience, every conscious experience that we have brings together a lot of information about the world in a way where we directly experience its relevance for our behavior and our future survival. We experience emotional responses to things. We experience what we might do, opportunities for action. Should I run away? Should I fight? Should I eat? So consciousness is extremely useful for us, and we can see this in what happens if we prevent conscious experience from happening. It's not, we're not very good at behaving anymore. So I think it's very likely evolved, but exactly when and exactly how, that's really, really hard to say. A big challenge here is that consciousness leaves no obvious fossil record. We can't trace it in the same way we might be able to trace the evolution of flying in birds. We can only make pretty speculative guesses based on what we think the minimal conditions for consciousness might be. Maybe there's a certain level of biological complexity below which consciousness is not needed for an organism in order to survive. Maybe very simple organisms that just can get by with simple reflexes. They don't need to be conscious to do what they do. But perhaps as soon as organisms need to bring together lots of information in a single unified way, or maybe that's when consciousness becomes really useful. I think it goes back at least to the beginning of all mammals. So that's several 100 million years ago, and likely a lot further than that too. And right now, in the animals that we share our world with, I think it's very likely widespread. All mammals, probably birds, possibly fish, certainly, very likely things like octopuses with very sophisticated brains. But it's a big open question, and nobody really knows how to develop a fully objective test. And some people say we should look at those animals closest to us in evolutionary terms, like monkeys and chimpanzees and things like that. Other people say, well, hold on, no, the best thing to do is to start with the simplest organisms and work up, like worms and insects. And we're always going to be biased by our anthropocentrism, which means like we see things through a human lens. We're going to be more likely to attribute consciousness to things which seem more similar to us, and less likely the further away, the more distant they seem. And there's some justification for that because we know we're conscious, so it makes sense that things that are more similar to us would be, everything else being equal, more likely. But it's not the only thing. And I think if we reserve consciousness just to those things that look like us, then we're going to miss a lot.
Do you think that consciousness just evolved is nothing special? It's just a mechanism for us to make better decisions. So it's not this wow thing that we find that most like all of this experience. It's just a mechanism that it just happens that evolution found as a cool way to make better decisions, and it's not really special. It's just like drinking water, or like I don't know. It's just like having blood or something.
I mean, given that it exists, it turns out to be very special, right? I mean, given that we are conscious, it's about the only thing that really matters. It defines what mattering means. Things matter because we experience things. If that's what gives life meaning, I think in a really basic sense. So consciousness is special in that way. A world without consciousness would be a very, very different world, and arguably it would be a world without purpose, without meaning. A world without subjectivity would be extraordinary. It's a very interesting question about whether consciousness was inevitable, or it was just like whether evolution could have gone a different way, and we don't know the answer to that. Are there other ways to sort of other evolutionary trajectories to complex organisms that don't involve consciousness. Philosophers always, well, not always, there's this thought experiment philosophers sometimes like to try out, which is called the philosophical zombie. Now, these aren't the zombies of the movies. These are philosophical zombies. And a philosophical zombie is a creature identical to a conscious organism, like identical to you or me. There could be a zombie Phidias, a zombie Anil, and these zombies would be outwardly indistinguishable from you or me. They would say the same things, even have this same conversation about consciousness. They would be absolutely identical, but there would be nothing it is like to be them. There would be no consciousness happening. Now, this is a well.
I bet they couldn't explain that well what consciousness is in a conversation if they never felt it, but maybe they will.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's the point. Like, if you have to allow that possibility, because that's the point. That's the definition of a zombie, that they're absolutely indistinguishable. Now, I mean, I don't really like this thought experiment because, I think it asks us to imagine something that actually is very, very difficult to imagine if we really take the task seriously. What we're being asked to do is imagine. Like, of course, I can imagine it in one sense. I just think, yeah, there's a version of me that's not conscious. But then if I really imagine what that would take, that's very complicated. It's a little bit like, I can imagine a plane flying backwards. Yeah, in one sense I can. I just, I close my eyes and I think of a plane that's moving backwards. But the more I know about aerodynamics and how planes work, the less conceivable it becomes. Planes do not fly backwards. That's not, you can't build a plane that way, actually, given the laws of physics as we have them. So I think philosophical zombies are much the same. The more we know about how brains work and how complicated the things are, the less conceivable it is that we could have all this going on without consciousness. But, it's still an open question. That it could be that, in this case, it doesn't have to be behaviorally identical. Perhaps on other planets, who knows? Perhaps there is life that has reached some level of complexity, but evolution in these alternative, life stories did not ever involve consciousness. And that, I think that would be remarkable if such a thing turn out to be. And who knows? Who knows what we'll find out there?
This is one of the questions that I have here. Do the aliens that we meet in the future, if an alien comes from a different planet, are they going to have consciousness or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's an open question. I think that our bias has to be yes, because we only know so far of one species that has escaped the limits of a planet, and that's us, and we're conscious. And for us, being conscious was very important in doing that. Consciousness is part of what gives us our species-specific creativity and power. So on that n=1 sample, we have to say, well, probably, if an alien species arrives, and so they're more likely to be conscious than not conscious, but it's certainly not a guarantee. Maybe evolution will have found a way. And actually our credence might start to go the other way, because we're beginning to now develop very powerful AI systems that are very likely not conscious. So, imagine that we send a bunch of highly sophisticated AI robots to some other planet, and there's some conscious living creatures on that planet, and they ask the question, oh, look, we've just been visited by, OpenAI's latest humanoid robot. Is it conscious? And if they use the same logic that I just said, like, well, to reach another planet, they have to like, that must involve consciousness. Well, that would be wrong, right? Because these robots probably are not. They're probably just hunks of silicon and code and metal. So the closer we get to designing intelligent systems which are not conscious, then I think, okay, and maybe it becomes very hard to know. what we should conclude when the aliens arrive, if they arrive. If they're made out of the same stuff and actually turn out to be relatively similar to us, well, that, then we're more likely to think, yeah, it's probably conscious. But if they're made out of metal or made out of something else altogether, and who knows? I mean, we don't have to indulge in these science fiction fantasies. I mean, just looking around the other animals that we share the world with, opinions have changed dramatically over the last centuries about what's conscious and what isn't. Even within humans. I mean, people, at least in medicine, there was an impression that human babies were not conscious for a while. That babies were not given anesthetic for surgeries until a few decades ago in some places, which now seems barbaric. And to me, that whereas in the medieval times in Europe, pigs and rats and even locusts were given criminal trials when they were perceived to have broken the law. So they were treated as fully conscious, not just conscious, but of sufficient conscious status that they could be held responsible for their actions. Now, that is just, from a modern perspective, that seems absolutely crazy. And I mention it, it's just firstly because it's really fun. I mean, some of these case studies of animal criminal prosecution are just absolutely hilarious. But it also shows how our attitudes to what's conscious and what's not can really change. And what we think of as intuitive and basically, yeah, well, of course, and just completely obvious now. Now let's wait another 100 years and let's see what happens. Might be very different again.
So in your famous TED talk that has now over 10 million views on YouTube, you said that you don't think the machines will develop consciousness. A lot has changed. Do you still stand by that statement?
I do. A lot has changed. It's been very exciting times in AI, and just the last few days. We're recording this after the OpenAI firm has just had this kind of convulsion at the top of its leadership. But there's an awful lot going on, and I find myself talking about AI a lot more with every passing month. And I work on it too. I mean, my PhD was in AI, and we work in this in my lab too. And so I've been really closely tracking, as far as I can, what's actually happening in the technicalities of these things too. And I still stand by that. I think, and I'm a bit of an outlier here. So many of my colleagues would make the assumption that consciousness does not depend on the kind of thing that something is made of. And they may even say something more strongly, that consciousness is a form of computational information processing. You hear this a lot. If you get the computations right, you get consciousness. This is a widely held assumption, but I don't think it's a very safe assumption. Current AI systems, even though they're a lot more powerful than they were 6 years ago, and are getting more powerful with every passing day, there's no good reason to think that they're approaching some threshold at which consciousness will suddenly appear. And the reason I think that is, we humans, we tend to conflate consciousness and intelligence. So we even get to the point where we think consciousness might be a function of intelligence, that as something gets more intelligent, it's more likely to become conscious, independent of everything else. Now, again, this is not entirely unjustified, because we have cognitive capabilities that other species don't have, and we know we're conscious. But it doesn't mean that consciousness is a function of intelligence. I think that to hold that view very strongly reveals something about our our species-specific biases, our human exceptionalism. We think we're special, and therefore consciousness and intelligence intrinsically go together. So here's one possibility. I don't think that consciousness will just come along for the ride as AI gets smarter, as we go from GPT-4 to GPT-5 or GPT-10. Just making machines smarter is not, in my mind, enough to say that they will become conscious at a particular point. Then there's this whole other question about whether consciousness is the kind of thing that a computer or a machine could even have, even in principle, even if you try to design it in and not just hope that it appears as intelligence increases. And this is a big unknown, right? As I said, many people assume that it is the kind of thing a computer could have. My own way of thinking and research has led me away from that view to the idea that consciousness is a property of living systems. Not all living systems, but maybe only living systems. So you need to be alive to be conscious. And just as in the same way, metabolism is not something that a computer really has. You plug a computer in, it consumes power, but it doesn't regenerate itself as an object in the same way that living creatures do. To put it a bit more simply, like there are some things which, if you simulate them, if you implement them on a computer, they're only ever at best a simulation, like a weather forecasting simulation. You can make a very detailed, very powerful simulation of the weather, as people do, but it never, ever gets wet or windy inside these computers. Even a perfect weather forecasting simulation would never itself be wet or windy. You need real water and real air for that to happen. Other things, yeah, computers can do them. A computer that plays chess really plays chess. It's playing chess. Doesn't matter that it's made out of silicon. Could be made out of anything. So the question is, consciousness more like chess or more like the weather? And my suspicion is it's more like the weather, that at best, computers will only simulate consciousness. They won't give rise to it. And I think that because I think consciousness and life are very closely tied together.
So, but you mentioned before that the real world that we see is something different than what we perceive. So maybe the water is not as different as the chess in a way. I don't know if you understand what.
No, I'm not. No, can you say a bit more what you mean there?
I'm very bad in explaining things. I don't know how to talk very well, but I will try to ask the question again. Can you describe again exactly what's the difference between the water and the chest?
Yeah.
Because
sure, I can try. So there are some things that when you try to implement them or simulate them on a computer, we can design a computer program that simulates the weather in however much detail we want. We could simulate every molecule of air moving around if we wanted to.
But this is how it's in the real world as well. Maybe it's exactly like that.
Okay, so all right, I see where you're going. So it may be that the world itself is a kind of computer simulation. I mean, there is an idea out there that's called the simulation hypothesis, that we are in fact living inside a simulation.
We had a whole podcast about that. We put it
right.
There. Yeah, continue.
Right. So that's true. I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, that would be a response. Like, maybe everything is a simulation, and so maybe this distinction collapses a little bit. But I find this idea that we all live in a simulation. I mean, that just poses the same question. It punts the question one step back. For the simulation hypothesis to be true, or to be credible, it has to be the case that consciousness is something that can be that for which simulating it generates it. That's a necessary precondition for the simulation hypothesis. Nick Bostrom says this in like the original paper. He just says like, okay, for the simulation hypothesis to make sense, it has to be the case that consciousness is the kind of thing that a computer could have, because consciousness exists, and if we live in a simulation, then consciousness is a property of the simulation configured in a particular way. So it just punts the question one stage back. It just assumes the answer to that question. And of course, assuming the answer to that question is for me not very satisfactory. I want to answer the question. I want to know, is consciousness something that can be simulated, or where simulation is enough to generate it, or whether it isn't? And I think, firstly, I don't think we do live in a simulation. I think that's a really strange idea without much reason to support it. But I'll have to listen to your podcast on it. So, yeah, I've kind of put that aside. And I think there is this real question, like, is consciousness something that a computer could have, or is it something that computers cannot have, because it really matters what the system is made of? It's not merely a matter of function or computation and things like that. Only if there's only a small set of things which can be generated by computation. Not everything can be done that way. At least I think so. And again, it's like maybe the whole universe is computing itself somehow, but I've never found those views particularly compelling. And I think, especially when we're talking about the the near-term prospects, then there is a real question about whether the kinds of computers that we have around us now, or will have in the next few years, whether consciousness is the kind of property they can have. I think the answer is likely no, but I don't know, right? I might be wrong, because there are plenty of other people who think the opposite. What I think is much more likely, and here's where people who disagree with me about that, we'd all agree very likely, is that AI will reach the point quite soon where it will seem conscious. In fact, I think this point has already, for a lot of people, been reached. And that is in itself a pretty dangerous position for society to be in. If we start to project consciousness into our language models, our virtual agents, then we are changing the game for society. Society has not faced a situation like this before. What do? Do we care about these things, even though we're not sure whether they're conscious or not? And we might even think they're not conscious, but they still seem like it. So do we start caring about them? And if we do that, then we might risk sacrificing human and our broader planetary interest in the service of lumps of silicon and code that feel nothing. And that would be a bad outcome. Either that, or we learn to not care about these things, even though they seem conscious. This is what happens in Westworld, in the science fiction film and series. People treat these robots badly on the basis that they're not conscious, even though they seem conscious. And of course, that does terrible things to our own minds.
Did you ever interacted with a real robot?
Yeah, I have, but the ones I've interacted with have been really, really, with all respect to the people that built them, they've not been very convincing. But this will change. This will change. Robotics has been lagging a little bit behind disembodied AI. Language models and vision models and things like that. Deep fakes have got a lot better. I think before I interact with a really convincing robot, I think it's very plausible that within the next few years, like, I could be talking to a deep fake version of you animated by a language model, and it might be very, very, very hard to be able to tell the difference, especially if I don't know you very well. I think that's a situation which is really around the corner. So certainly in the virtual world, when we're not physically interacting with things, I think we're going to face challenges very soon where we'll project consciousness into things which will just be lines of code. That's going to be challenging. That's going to be ethically very complicated, very difficult, psychologically and anthropologically. We need to do a lot of work to figure out how we can live in a society like this. What's the effect on us? What's the effect on children growing up in a society like this? How will it make us think about our ethics? What will it do to our minds? How should we design systems? There are design choices here as well. And here I'm thinking again about what's happening in the industry and OpenAI. And we've got these conflicting goals and desires to develop these systems very rapidly and to develop them safely. And the pace at which technology is changing is not really accommodating the slowly approach where we would say, okay, let's hold off on developing the next iteration of deepfakes and language models until we've done 5 years of empirical psychological studies to see how people respond to these things. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So we're going headlong into territory where we don't know what the consequences are going to be.
So you are scared when you see all these companies doing all these things?
A little bit, yes. I think one of the issues here is that people get scared of AI for all sorts of different reasons, and often these reasons get lumped together. People get scared of AI because of the word, and I think the word is a problem. AI has got such baggage from science fiction, like from HAL in 2001 to the Terminator or whatever, and it's also got this mystique, like AI is complicated. We'll never understand what's going on. We have to leave it to the computer scientists, nerds, to figure it out and tell us what to do. So there's a fear based on perceived inaccessibility and complexity. There's a fear based on a whole history of science fiction tropes. Then there are fears based on like the more existential end. So you have some people, even Elon Musk has said this, right? That AI poses an existential threat to humanity. We might not survive it. That's you can't rule it out, but it's very hard to know what to make of an idea like that. And then there are much more near-term threats, like the ones we've just been talking about, like deepfakes and language models that are going to take people's jobs. They're going to screw around with our psychologies. They're going to disrupt all kinds of professions. They're going to be very disruptive in society. And I don't think we're prepared for them. So I think we often lose track and focus on these immediate threats when we confuse them with the more uncertain existential threats and the perhaps unnecessary threats that are associated with the science fiction tropes and the term AI itself. So I think what we need to do is just separate out all these different aspects of the technology and its impact on society, because to deal with the threats effectively, we need to see them clearly.
But it will never get consciousness.
Well, I wouldn't say never. I mean, yeah. So I think it's very unlikely. But again, I might be wrong, and the consequence of that actually happening is very severe. So I think we collectively need to pay attention to that possibility and actually minimize the chances of it happening. So here's just what there certainly was, I don't know if there still is, but I kept hearing from people in the AI industry that it was a goal. It's a goal to build a conscious machine. That would be amazing.
But
goal.
Why to stop this for happening?
Well, because anyone who's read Frankenstein would understand why. There's many lessons from literature about the dangers of this Promethean sin, this hubristic desire to create things in our own image. And Frankenstein is such a... I read the book this year. I'd seen plenty of films. The book is so good. And reading Frankenstein again this year, I realized that what the real problem was in Frankenstein, you often think of it as a moral, a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving life to something, creating life, endowing this artificial creature with life. But what really matters, thinking about it now, is not that Frankenstein's creature was alive, but that it's conscious. The ability of the creature to feel misery and envy and resentment and rejection and ostracism. That's what led to all the mayhem and havoc. If we create artificial consciousness, this is bad for several reasons. Firstly, we have the possibility that we may create lots of artificial suffering that we may not even recognize because it may be different from our own. And we might generate it at unprecedented scale. We tap a button, we create on server farms huge new instances of suffering that we don't even know we're doing. This would be ethically catastrophic. If we create artificial consciousness, and we know that we have, then we have to take that consciousness into account. Morally and ethically, we have a duty and a responsibility to it. And so we immediately bring about conflicts between our own interests and the interests of the conscious systems that we've created, because these interests won't necessarily align. We wouldn't be able to turn a system off just because we didn't like what it was doing, because it would have a right to remain turned on. So those are two pretty good reasons, I think, why we shouldn't be trying to build a conscious machine. And the third reason, of course, is that even if we fail to, we will still end up building machines that seem conscious. And again, as we've discussed, that in itself is problematic.
This exact topic is the reason why Elon Musk and Larry Page stopped being friends. Because Elon Musk was supporting your point of view that we need to be very cautious, we need to put humans first. But Larry Page was supporting the position that no, we don't need to be stop the evolution. We need to embrace it and let it happen. And maybe if it's going to lead to our extinctions, let it be for the greater purpose of evolution. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm probably not very often in agreement with Elon Musk on things, but here I'm definitely on that side. And I think, there's a motto in Silicon Valley, move fast and break things. I think that's the wrong approach now. These technologies are very powerful. Even if they don't actually become conscious themselves, they're interacting with our minds in ways that no other technology has done before this. And we need to be careful. In other industries, this kind of care is normal. People don't release a new drug onto the market before extensively testing it. People won't release a new kind of aircraft into the market testing. You wouldn't imagine if the airline industry said, oh, we've got this new plane, and it might have a 50% chance of crashing, but let's see, it'll get you where you're going a bit faster. I mean, that wouldn't that literally would not fly, that idea. Yet in AI, it's harder to regulate, but I think it's important. And of course, regulation is not necessarily in opposition to innovation either. I think once we decide what we want AI to be used for, here's another challenge. We talk about it a lot, and people say things like, yes, we want AI to solve climate change and to design new medicines. There's lots of specific application cases, but a general vision for what AI systems are supposed to do and how they fit into our world is, I think, still a bit lacking. And I think a good way to think of AI is not from this relatively naive perspective as let's build artificial general intelligence, like an AI system that is as intelligent, which would immediately be more intelligent than us. Instead of building things in our own image, we should ask the question, how do we best complement our own minds and our brains? Think of AI as tools rather than colleagues, as one of my mentors, Daniel Dennett, has often said. And that perspective, just leads us away from this, I think, frankly, naive goal of AI that we should be building things that are as identical to us as possible, and then will become just superhuman versions of us. Once we do that, then regulation can actually help us get there, because it can channel investment into the right kind of technological development rather than just holding it back entirely. I mean, that's not going to work. We had this idea of let's just pause everything. No, that's never going to work. What we need to do is channel and direct it in the right ways.
Okay, so I had in the I was a normal human being believing in normal science and all this stuff, but I had in my podcast Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Castra, and I had also panpsychism people and all this stuff. So they started convincing me about these idealisms and this believing that the world is not real and all this stuff. What is your critique to them? And maybe if you can briefly explain to the audience, if you understand their position, what is their position?
Well, I can't speak for them directly, but you've spoken to them already. I've known these people, had debates and conversations. So I don't go as far as these ideas. So let's take them one at a time. So panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, that it's everywhere somehow, part of everything, a bit like mass or energy, charge, something like that. It's a very old philosophical position, panpsychism, and it's enjoying a little bit of a renaissance right now. There are people like Philip Goff who speak very eloquently about panpsychism, but I'm just not convinced at all.
We had him on the podcast right. as well.
So he and I have had fun and illuminating, at least for me, debates about consciousness and panpsychism. And I'm in print critical of his ideas. I don't think panpsychism has anything of substance to offer to us. It almost defines the problem of consciousness away, and introduces new problems. If consciousness is part of everything, then of course you don't have to explain how specific things like embodied brains give rise to consciousness, generate it, or are identical to consciousness, or entail consciousness in some way. But at the same time, you've got other problems, like if consciousness is fundamental and part of everything, then why am I as a human being conscious in a different way to all of the atoms that compose me? This is the combination problem in panpsychism. But I think the more pressing problem is, at least the way certainly Philip Goff explains panpsychism, is that it becomes, by definition, can't impact any actual experiment at all. It's not that panpsychism itself is testable. In a sense, that doesn't matter, but something needs to be useful in an explanatory way. It needs to generate some testable predictions. And the problem with panpsychism, it's supposed to be the intrinsic essence of things. It's supposed to be that part of anything that is not defined in terms of how it interacts with other things. And if you define it that way, then it can't make a difference to anything. And so it can never make any distinctive prediction for any experiment that you might ever conceive. So it's a bit of a blind alley. It might be right, but there's no way of knowing, and there's no way of it helping us understand anything at all. So I'm just not convinced by panpsychism.
What
Don
about
Hoffman.
idealism?
Well,
Yes, and Donald Hoffman, his idea, I'm convinced he sold me on the idea. I'm curious for you to sell me on your idea.
No, well, I mean, hopefully, based on what we were saying earlier, it's so I'm not an idealist, right? Idealism is the idea that okay, so the standard view is something like physicalism, materialism. So there's an objective world out there made of stuff, whatever this stuff is, whether it's quarks or superstrings or whatever, there's stuff of some sort. And then consciousness is a property of this stuff arranged in some way, somehow. Right? That's the sort of mainstream philosophical view. It accommodates a huge amount of different theories, different, whatever, but idealism goes the other way and says, no, actually, what's fundamental is mental stuff, and physical stuff is not really primary in any sense. It's just we infer it, as it's a useful fiction for our conscious minds to understand our sensations and perceptions and so on. So idealism's got a very long history in philosophy as well, but it's basically the idea that consciousness is primary, that's what exists, everything else is secondary. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness exists in the same way as everything else, so it's not idealism because it sort of equals, it's just there's also material stuff and consciousness. And then my view, which is a broadly physicalist view, again, probably the mainstream view that accommodates many different positions within it, that there is real stuff out there and consciousness is a property of that real stuff in ways that we don't yet understand. So Don Hoffman, he goes towards idealism. Interestingly, we start off in a very similar way by recognizing that how things seem in our conscious experience is not how they are in reality. That
you have so many similarities,
so
many similarities in the way that you describe things.
There's a lot of similarities, and especially that kind of starting point where we can think of conscious experience as a construction. He uses the term user interface, which I don't like because it implies there's a user using the interface, and I think rather the user is part of the interface, and so I think that metaphor is just not useful. But I do agree with him that the way in which experiences of the world happen are very indirectly related to their causes. But where we depart is he then...
What do you mean they are indirectly related to the causes?
Well, just like that, right back to the example we had of colors and things like that. So, when I experience a color, it's not that there is a real color red out there. No, the color that I experience, even though I experience the color as being out there, no, it's my mind, my brain is constructing that from, in this case, the ratio of different wavelengths that themselves, and the way the brain uses those is to grip onto something else, which is how surfaces reflect light. And that's what I mean by indirect. And I think Don and I agree about that what we experience does not directly reflect what's there. And then we can ask the very interesting question of how far does this go? I mean, we talked about colors. I think this applies to not just colors, but like every aspect of what we experience is a construction. We can even go far into things like time and space. Are those actually constructions as well? Does time flow in reality in the way that we perceive it to flow? Is space three-dimensional in the way that we experience it as three-dimensional? These are very interesting questions. In philosophy, this gets right back to Kant as well, about these a priori structures through which we interpret the universe. Here, I think it's very interesting. It's quite it's certain that time as we experience it is not the same as time as it is in physics. And we notice it's like time subjectively can slow down, speed up, and so on. And in my group with my colleague Warwick Roseman, we've done lots of experiments looking at how the brain constructs the experience of time. So I think really interesting to ask, how deep can we go into the structure of our experience, explaining it using this strategy? And Don goes very far too. That's his ambition. But then he also goes a bit further and says, actually, what's out there, what reality is, rather than it being stuff that we have indirect access to, as far as I understand him, he says what's actually out there are conscious agents. So that's a form of idealism, that the base reality is consciousness. And here, I must admit, this is where I get off the bus. I don't see any reason why that idea should be compelling. It's not compelling to me. But it's interesting because I think we do agree on an awful lot, and I think that's good. But we disagree about this more fundamental perspective on what the universe actually consists in.
So that's the only difference, maybe the other difference. But while you were explaining me before that it's mostly the stuff that is happening there in our consciousness, and this is how we project the world, how we think the world, make better predictions because of. So the thing that you disagree is, you agree that consciousness is so important and all this stuff, but he believes that there is not a word out there, and that's the word inside our head, and you believe that there is a word.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I think it's a good working assumption that there is a universe out there made of stuff, and that consciousness is not the fundamental thing in the universe. There's stuff, and consciousness is a property of some of that stuff, and some of that stuff is us.
Interesting. I ask every guest on the podcast, I give you $1 trillion and you have a goal to maximize the positive impact on humanity. Mm-hmm. How do you spend it?
Can I spend it on more than one thing?
Yes.
Maximize a positive impact on humanity. $1 trillion is a lot. So, what I wouldn't do is invest it all into building a conscious machine. I think it's pretty clear that would not be the best way to invest $1 trillion. The answer I ought to give from the perspective of my profession is, well, we should really fund neuroscience and consciousness research to figure out how consciousness happens, because only by doing that will we be able to solve all the challenges of mental illness, figure out how and why we make the bad decisions for our planet that we do, and so on. But actually, I would probably be much more pragmatic about how we should spend $1 trillion. Thinking about the state the planet is in, I think we should develop with great urgency. We should develop things like nuclear fusion, so we can have limitless clean power. I think we're probably pretty close. I'm no expert. Everyone keeps saying it's 30 years away, but I think it does seem to be getting closer. That's going to cost a lot of money to change our energy system so that we can move totally away from fossil fuels. I think addressing that will address another existential. Whether AI poses an existential crisis is still somewhat speculative, but we can be pretty sure that climate change is. And so if we can properly get a handle on that, then that's one thing we really should do. And then I think we should transform medicine so that we can keep people healthy for longer in an equitable way across the whole world, and not just in the rich countries. So this involves drug development, drug design, funding. I mean, these things rapidly cost a lot of money. And then the third thing I think we need to prioritize, again, probably even further away from my own field, well, not so far away, is to shore up our institutions against threats of things like disinformation, deep fakes, language models. Democracy is under threat. Next year is going to be very challenging. A large fraction of the world's democracies are having elections next year, and the threat posed by misinformation, deep fakes, and so on is enormous. And I think we need stability, because the other existential threat that people have tended to forget about is nuclear war. And all the progress we might make in other ways could be wiped out in an instant. And we've gotten lucky so far, but we need to strengthen our institutions to make sure as best we can that doesn't happen. We need to solve the medical problems that make life miserable for so many people in the world, and we need to reverse climate change. That'll cost more than $1 trillion, but it's a good place to start.
You spoke that you had a mentor, Mr. Dennett. So what was the ways that you personally learned? A lot of young people watch this podcast, which they are trying to go about their careers and trying to learn stuff and trying to kind of hack their ways into careers. What is your advice to them, and what is your personal way that you develop your career?
I was thinking about this actually in the challenges faced by the students I have at Sussex University, where I work and teach. The landscape is so different now. 30 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, there was no internet. There was nothing like that. So I'd talk to people and I'd read books. And so Daniel Dennett is one of the people that's been really inspirational for me over the years, but one among quite a number of people. And I've been lucky to get to know some of these people in the course of my career. But 30 years ago, we were quite limited, right? I mean, we could basically just read stuff. And I was very fortunate then to read Daniel Dennett's book he published in 1991 called Consciousness Explained. And that was a turning point for me, because it suggested that, there's a there when it comes to consciousness. It's not, there's something to be done. There's a practical, useful, and endlessly interesting journey to follow here, which wasn't clear from the courses I was taking, which were much more about how rats behave and things like that. And I needed that spark of inspiration. Now, today, people, I think, face a very different challenge, which is there's too much stuff out there. There's an endless stream of podcasts. And of course, everyone should be listening to yours, and I'm sure that would be fine. But there's a lot of other ones as well. And so the question now is, how do people deal with this overwhelm of choice? You could spend an eternity soaking up information, listening to all the people that, pretty much everyone you might want to hear from has got videos online somewhere or other. So I think you need to be very selective again here. And so in a sense, the role a good mentor can play is important, because having someone who's been in a field for a while can help you figure out what's the best way to spend your time. Who should you be listening to? You should always explore a range of perspectives and see what you think. But there's too much of everything, and so some guidance is always helpful. Now, the advice I would have then is try and find that mentor. Try and find someone who can guide you to be selective about what you watch, what you listen to. If it's difficult, then start off with the more mainstream stuff. Something like consciousness, for instance, it's very attractive to go immediately to the fringes, because it's like, wow, we don't understand what consciousness is, and so here's this wild and crazy idea. But the mainstream, although there's a lot more to learn, the resources are wonderful. Once you learn those, you realize that it's not, consciousness science isn't this boring dead end. It's hugely exciting at the frontiers. It's hugely exciting. So there's a lot to learn the mainstream. So that's one thing. And just stay curious. Like, I didn't expect to end up having the privilege to work on consciousness for my career, but it's turned out that way. And you have to have the flexibility to do different things. Like, it's only by having done a number of different things in the course of my career that you come up with a distinctive point of view. It's not that I suddenly had this distinctive point of view perfectly formed. It's still evolving, and it's developed by doing different things and talking to different people and keeping learning from different people all the time. Don't make your mind up too quickly. Like, people can get overly convinced of things being right or wrong very early, and I think that can lead to a closed-mindedness. And finally, be skeptical. Like, there's a lot of claims that under scrutiny don't stand up. A lot of experiments actually don't stand up either. The fact that a research paper claims that X is true, that doesn't mean that X is true. It means there is one research paper that claims that X is true. And so be skeptical, but constructively skeptical. Those are some things that I would bear in mind.
Are you afraid of death?
I try not to be. And in my book, I talk about this a little bit. And it brings us back
Which, by the way, I think is one of the best covers of books I ever saw. It's so beautiful aesthetically, the eye, and it makes sense because everyone has a unique eye. So it's beautiful.
Oh, I'm glad at least the cover's good. Hopefully the bit in the middle is good as well. But if the cover's good, that's a start.
No, because I'm a marketer, I'm making YouTube videos and I make thumbnails. So it was very beautiful for me to see.
Oh, thank you. No, I mean, the cover actually is one of those things. In writing the book, I didn't realize how much discussion there would be about covers and so on. But no, I'm glad it's working. Am I afraid of death? Well, I think one consequence of working on consciousness is, firstly, you realize how precious it is, and how easily and fragile it is, how easily it can be disrupted. So it can make you a little bit more fearful of the many ways in which consciousness can go wrong. But in fact, the idea of losing consciousness entirely, in a sense, you can become a little bit more comfortable with that. It's a bit like the non-experience of general anesthesia again. When there's no experience, there is no pain, there is no suffering, there is nothing at all. And in that non-experience is a kind of premonition of the oblivion of death. So this helps me become a little less afraid of it, but then I'm not staring it right in the face, and I just don't know what I'll think when it's really close. And of course, there is the fear of missing out, which is different from the fear of death. There's a lot of stuff I just want to do and think and be around for. And yeah, I wish life was longer. I'm already thinking, like, how many years realistically? And that's not the same thing as fearing death. That's just like wishing life was longer.
Very interesting that you're saying that probably most of what fear of death is fear of missing out in the other things.
Yeah.
It's a form of fear.
It is, but then you come back to the oblivion point, that we all experience fear of missing out, and if we do not, in any given day, like I can experience the angst of not being at this event that I wanted to go to, or this thing that I wanted to do. That is what the fear of missing out feels like, and it's not a nice feeling. But of course, in oblivion, after death, you won't have those feelings.
Yeah.
So you can have this fear of missing out in the abstract, that there will be things you will miss out on, and you might miss out on a lot of interesting, positive experiences. And I think it's rational to be, slightly annoyed about that. It's like, I'm annoyed. There are things that ideally I would like to experience, which I won't because I'll be dead. But in that state of being dead, there won't be any FOMO because there won't be anything.
Okay, so this is how we end the podcast every time. So you are going to die after this podcast.
Oh.
And this is the only words that you have to broadcast to the world, whatever your last word, your last words. So if you ever die in 20, 30 years from now, 100 years, we're going to come back and see what your message is.
Yeah. This is a really tough one. I'm sorry. I'm struggling. There's far too much to say.
It's good. Take your time. You are going to be dead, so it's okay.
That is true. What would I say as the last words? I think what I'd like to think I'd be in a position to say would be something like, that now that I know I'm about to die, it's still okay. That even when it's moments away, that there is really nothing to be frightened of. It's a little bit cryptic. But I think it's getting the point that, I'm still intrigued about this. I don't want to find out anytime soon. But whether it's possible to cultivate that attitude that apparently some people, with deep experience of meditation cultivate, and to be really unafraid of it, to recognize that everything changes, that there's an impermanence. To have that kind of feeling at that time would be something I would like to say, that yes, there really is nothing to be afraid of. And if people are still getting all messed up about AI, I might also add that the problem isn't artificial intelligence, it's real stupidity.
Thank you guys for listening. We love you. Thank you, Anil, for being here and taking the time. And we love everybody that watches this podcast until the end.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a great conversation. Really interesting.